Thanks, everyone. Let's see. I don't know if I need this. I probably don't, but it's always good so people can hear. I'm going to sort of stay over here so you can see this here, because if I start walking around like this, then you can't see anything. So this is a talk that's in a series about how Shakespeare impacts, or ideas from Shakespeare impact on current political concerns. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was how Shakespeare represents families. And this is something that I think that it's interesting to think how families are represented, because everyone, I think, tends to assume that the family they grew up with, or the family that they imagine that their parents grew up with, is the family. That that's the way it was, that that's the natural way that it should be, that there's something natural about families. And obviously there is something natural about families. Every society, the family is part of society and so on. But the way that families are organized and the norms for living in families change very much over time. Now, we often look back at Shakespeare as something that's sort of somehow culturally central to us. That Shakespeare in some ways is foundational for Anglo-American culture, for English language writing, for literature. And we look back to these texts as kind of authoritative statements about the way that things were, or the way that things should be, or we often go to them for cultural norms. And what's interesting about Shakespeare and Families is his families look very, very different from the families that most of us experience. And I'd like to just take a little look at that for a few minutes tonight and sort of think a bit about how the family relationships in his plays, which are still very powerful for us. You know, if you think about Hamlet, okay, #1 Shakespeare play, right? Hamlet. Hamlet is a family story. It's about a son's relationship with his mother. It's about a son's relationship to dealing with the death of his father. It's about a feud between a son and an uncle. It's very much a family story. King Lear is also a family story. And we, you know, these plays that are so dominant in our culture have this kind of, you know, they're founded on stories about family in ways that we still recognize. When we see Hamlet or we see King Lear, they speak to us in various ways. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this talk tonight, and we wouldn't be putting the plays on, and they wouldn't be making movies out of them, and actors wouldn't want to play Hamlet. So there's something there that's resonant, but at the same time, there's a lot of differences. And so I thought we'd just take a look at that and explore some of these issues. While we're going through this, I'll be talking, obviously, a fair bit. If anyone has any concerns or questions, you know, feel free to raise a hand or something. We can sort of go back and forth while I'm talking. This doesn't have to be me talking at you for half an hour or something like that. We can actually sort of have a conversation around these things, and we can certainly go off, you know, in different directions. Let's just see if this works from here. There we go. Okay, I love this picture. I found this picture when I was preparing for this talk. This is a 19th century German print, and Shakespeare is very popular in 19th century Germany, of what it was like in Shakespeare's home. And I guess I could start by saying, well, I'm not sure if everyone can see this as well as you might, but I'll just sort of point things out. Here is the man himself, sort of at the center of everything. His wife is sitting over here, and she's listening to every word he says as he talks. You'll notice that she's not wasting time. She's also sewing. She's multitasking. She's listening to Shakespeare and sewing at the same time. He has 2 daughters, and they're sitting, you know, one is under his arm there, and the other one is kneeling at his feet, looking up at him with rapt attention. I'm not sure who this is supposed to be. I think this must be supposed to be a servant boy. Shakespeare had a son, but the son died relatively young, younger than this kid looks. And he was also a twin with one of the girls, and those girls both look older than him. So I'm assuming this is supposed to be a servant. Off in the passageway, you can see the sort of scullery maid there washing the dishes in the kitchen. She's sort of listening. What is Shakespeare going to say next? And then there's an older gentleman here who is also sort of listening. I don't know who this is supposed to be. Perhaps it's meant to be John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father. But and I love the dog too. The dog is sort of sitting there, you know, keeping the floor warm. And of course, it's an artistic household. They've got a portrait of Queen Elizabeth up on the wall. They've got a lute on the floor, which is not the best place to keep your lute, but you know. So let's just start. What is wrong with this picture? What is wrong or seems odd about this picture? This obviously was someone's idea of just what things must have been like in the 16th century. What is wrong with this picture?
Everything.
Everything. Yeah, pretty much.
He was never at home hardly.
He was never at home. Yes, for starters, Shakespeare was never at home. You may have heard that he had a career in a place called London putting on plays. He lived in London, in fact, for about 20 years putting on plays, journeying home to Stratford in the summertime when the theaters were closed to see his wife and family who never came with him to London. So this would have been a rare occasion, if anything like this ever happened, for him to actually be there. Yes, you had your hand.
Well, that's why everyone's all wrapped. That's the one day a year
Yeah, so this didn't happen very often, that he was home like this. And also it assumes a kind of family life that is obviously idealized around the notion that Shakespeare is being treated in his family like we would sort of imagine him culturally. That he is the great sage, the great wise person, and everyone, notice it's all women, children, and old people. There are no other men in this picture, adult men. It really is all women, servants, children, old people, all the sort of socially, by early modern standards, socially inferior people are circled around the great man to hear his wisdom. As far as we can determine, that wasn't how people thought of Shakespeare during his lifetime. It may have been how some people in Germany and other places thought of him in the 19th century, but not in his lifetime. So it's interesting because one of the things this suggests to me is that we always imagine the past in the terms of our own period. And it's easier for us now, in the beginning of the 21st century, to look back at 19th century Germany and say, oh, they were so dumb, they thought Shakespeare was like this. But the fact of the matter is, however we represent Shakespeare in 150 years, if people still care, it's going to look just as silly, because it's going to look just as tied to our concerns, our ideas, what we think is important, the ideas that we want to get across about our own time. So anyway, that's a fantasy of Shakespeare's home life. Let's see if we can get a little closer to what things might have been like. Let's start by thinking about now Shakespeare didn't leave much writing behind except for his literary works. He left behind his plays. There's between 35 and 37, 38 of them, depending on how you count, and whether you accept that he collaborated on some of them or not. He left behind a series of about 152 sonnets, 154, can't remember, and a couple of narrative poems. He didn't leave behind any personal documents about himself. He didn't leave behind anything like a diary, or no letters survive. He turns up in some legal documents not associated with him. They're mostly his neighbors have a legal dispute and he's called in as a witness, that kind of thing. And in church records, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But nothing survives from his own, he didn't write about his own life, or if he did, it hasn't survived. So how does he represent families in his plays? Well, let's start out. There are a lot of plays that have dead or absent fathers. Hamlet, we already talked about. Hamlet, as you know if you've read the play or seen a production or a film, it opens up, Hamlet is very sad and distraught and depressed because his father has died. So dead father, right at the beginning. All's Well That Ends Well, not as well known a play, but written around the same time as Hamlet. The young man in that play also has no father, and he's become a ward of the king, and he has to go journey to the king's court, where the king will dispose of him by marrying him off to a woman he hates. So, who's madly in love with him, which is where the story gets going. But in any case, there's another example of a main character in a Shakespeare play whose father is dead and he has to deal with that. Coriolanus, a Roman play based on Roman history. Coriolanus has the mother from hell, but he has no father living. He's a warrior. His mother, very interesting sort of mother-son relationship there. If you haven't read the play, it's worth a look. But no dad. Plays with dead or absent mothers. There are lots of these. These aren't exclusive lists. I just thought of ones that, would come to mind. Taming of the Shrew. Petruchio comes to wive it wealthily in Padua. The girls he's marrying don't seem to have a mother. They have a father who's interested in marrying them off, possibly to Petruchio, but no no mother there for those girls. Midsummer Night's Dream, also the young lovers have fathers in the play. We never see the mothers. It's not determined there that they've passed away, but we never see them. Henry IV. Henry IV has a son. Henry V, he doesn't seem to have a wife. Henry V, Prince Hal in those plays, never hear anything about his mother. Again, it's not so much that we hear that they're dead, but they're just not there. Merchant of Venice. Merchant of Venice, Shylock, the Jewish moneylender who's at the center of that play, has a daughter, Jessica, wife dead. Othello. We've got Desdemona, who falls in love with the Moorish general Othello. She has a father who is very upset to hear that his wife has married someone of African descent. No mother to complain about that. King Lear has 3 daughters, no wife living. The Tempest, Prospero and his only daughter are marooned on an island sort of on the edge of civilization. Again, mother long dead, never got to the island, not there. So lots of plays with dead or absent mothers. Plays with orphans. Was it Oscar Wilde who said losing one parent is a catastrophe, losing 2 looks like carelessness? Plays with orphans. Much Ado About Nothing. Beatrice, who's the main female character in that play, has no parents. She's a ward of her uncle. Benedict, who's the main male character, we also hear that we never hear anything about his parents. He seems to be detached. And that's part of why, if you know that play or if you remember the Kenneth Branagh film, that's partly why they can marry for love, because nobody cares. They don't have any family. Merchant of Venice, again. Portia, who's the main female character in that play, her mother died a long time ago, her father died just recently, and has a very interesting trick for getting a husband for her by playing a game with opening boxes. Twelfth Night, the main characters in that play, Viola and Sebastian, a pair of twins, parents both dead, they're orphans. All's Well That Ends Well, the girl that the main male character is going to be married to by the king against his will, she's an orphan living as a ward in his house. So again, lots of plays with orphans. Plays with childless couples, so we get the opposite. Macbeth, famously. Lady Macbeth has never had a... Well, Lady Macbeth is unclear, because she says, I know what it's like to breastfeed, but later another character says that Macbeth has no children. And certainly we see no living children of theirs in the play, so maybe Macbeth, maybe we're meant to think that Lady Macbeth had a child who died in infancy, or maybe it's a contradiction in the text, we don't know, but in any case, the Macbeths have no offspring. Richard II, he's the King of England, he has no heir, he does have a wife, they don't have kids. Julius Caesar, we see Julius Caesar's wife, no child, no natural child of theirs to inherit the empire from Julius Caesar. Merry Wives of Windsor, they may be merry wives, but they don't seem to have any children. So, I won't comment on that. So if you start looking, you're looking at all sorts of plays here. Tragedies, comedies, histories, all the kinds of plays, romances that Shakespeare wrote. Lots of broken families. I can only think off the top of my head of one family in Shakespeare that has 2 parents and a child. Romeo and Juliet. You see how well that went. And yeah, in Romeo and Juliet, you've got parents with children, but almost in no other Shakespeare play do you have a family that has parents with children. Now, some of this, why? Why? Well, dead or absent mothers, they only have so many male actors in the company who can play women. You need, you know, how many are you going to... But still, there's something more than that going on here. This is not just casting. This is a pattern. All of these families are broken. Well, let's look at Shakespeare's own family, and this is my favorite biography of Shakespeare. It's very quick. It was written by George Steevens, who was an editor of Shakespeare's plays in the 18th century. He was a friend of Samuel Johnson, and here it is, the biography of Shakespeare. Let's go. All that is known with any degree of certainty concerning Shakespeare is that he was born at Stratford-upon-Avon, married and had children there, went to London, where he commenced actor and wrote poems and plays, returned to Stratford, made his will, died, and was buried. That was true in the 18th century, and that's true now. Those are the only things about Shakespeare's life that are documented. You've got it all there. He was born in Stratford-on-Avon. We know that because his baptismal record survives. We don't know his birthday. We know the day he was baptized. We know that he was married because there's a record of that in the church documents. We know that he had children because we see their church records of them getting baptized. We know he went to London. We don't know how he got to London. We'll talk about that in a bit. We know that in London, after a while, he is an actor writing poems and plays. And we know that after a while, he returns to Stratford, buys a house. Stephen's left that out. Made his will, died, and was buried. And that's really all we know. Now that's a fair bit to know about someone in the 17th century who's not sort of part of the royal family or the nobility or someone like that. But it's not very much to go on. Still, we can learn a lot if we sort of dig a little deeper with this very short version to find out a little bit about what Shakespeare's family life might have been like. Here is the house that John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father, owned, and presumably he was born there because most kids were born at home. It's certainly treated as Shakespeare's birthplace. If you go to Stratford in England, they make a big deal out of it. His father was a tanner, so a leather worker. Good middle-class occupation, nothing fancy, but certainly not poverty. Nice big house. Here's his grave monument, Trinity Church, Stratford-on-Avon, and this is one of the questions that we often have is, what did Shakespeare look like? Well, this statue was made for his tomb shortly after he died and presumably had some resemblance to him or people wouldn't have been happy with it. Nobody wants Shakespeare to look like this. He looks a little chubby, he looks kind of a little dull, he's not a particularly interesting looking guy, a little stiff, yeah, and you know, this is partly the quality of English tomb sculpture in, you know, provincial market towns in the mid-17th century, but still, yeah, okay, that's a start. This is the one everybody knows. This is the Droeshout engraving from the cover of Shakespeare's first folio, 1623. 1623 was 7 years after Shakespeare died, for a start. The engraver who did this did a lot of other engravings, and the one I always tell my students is a few years after he did this one, he did the first, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, put out a book of poems as a young man. And he did it fancy, and he got an engraving himself at the front. And there's a picture of John Milton done by this engraver at the front of that book of poems that Milton put together. The picture looks like no other picture of John Milton, and there are good likenesses of John Milton from later in his life. Looks nothing like him. Milton asked the engraver if he could engrave something in Greek underneath. Can you engrave Greek letters? Sure, I can. Do you know how to read Greek? No, but I can engrave letters. Okay, good, go ahead. So Milton, who was very good at Greek, had the engraver write underneath a phrase in Greek that translates to something like, "Laugh, my friends, at this bad image by a bad artist." Which was kind of mean of Milton to do that, but there's a long way of saying, who knows if this is what Shakespeare looked like. The engraver who did it, we know, did not always keep close tabs to what people looked like in real life. We know that from the Milton case. And it's done 7 years after Shakespeare passed away, so it's certainly not done from life or something like that. If you're the kind of person who pays close attention to engraving and art historical things, you'll notice that it's actually not a very good quality engraving. The eyes don't match, they're at different levels. It's workman-like stuff, but it's not any great work of engraving. So still, what have we got to go on? This is the one everybody likes. Shakespeare looks like a pirate here. This is the Chandos portrait from 1610. He looks much more interesting than that guy, either, you know, than the guy on the grave monument. Only problem with this is nobody has any idea if it really is a picture of Shakespeare or not. It's got a better claim than most of the other portraits from when he was alive, but there's absolutely no proof that this is what he looked like, so we don't really know what Shakespeare looked like. We do have this. This is the official record of Shakespeare's baptism, and it says in Latin, Gulielmus filius Johannes Shakespeare on the 26th, the month is April, so on the 26th of April, William, son of John Shakespeare, baptized. So that's what we've got to go on when we're trying to figure out Shakespeare's life, is these little fragments of records. So he was baptized. That probably meant that he was born a couple days before, because they used to wait usually a few days before they baptized to see if the child would, you know, the child might die, and then not worth baptizing them. Though in other communities, baptize them as quickly as you can. But in any case, they decided in the 19th century, when Shakespeare was highly, highly venerated in England, that he must have been born on April the 23rd, because by God, that's St. George's Day. The day of the patron saint of England. What better day for Shakespeare to have been born? If you look at your literary calendars, it'll say that Shakespeare was born on April 23rd. Maybe he was. As Hemingway said, wouldn't it be pretty to think so? Here's another picture that is very vague in terms of its connection to historical reality, and it is a little hard to see because it's a pencil drawing. This may or may not be a picture of Anne Hathaway, who's the young lady that Shakespeare married. It doesn't date from her lifetime, so probably even if it is a picture of Anne Hathaway, it's not a particularly good likeness. But again, this is what we try to go on when we're looking for pictures. Her cottage still survives, and it's lovely. It's much nicer than John Shakespeare's house. It's on the edge of town. It's got a pretty garden. It's got a thatched roof. And she was from a family that seems to have been fairly similar to Shakespeare's family in that they owned some land around Stratford. They were not poor, but not rich. They were part of the life of this provincial town. So let's go a little deeper into Shakespeare's own family history. Here's the first thing we know besides when he was born and who his parents were. In 1582, aged 18, Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, aged 26. Their daughter Suzanne was born 5 months later. What do we deduce from this? Or to go back to the earlier way I phrased it, what's wrong with this picture? Yeah.
Nothing's wrong with the picture because they could have been hand-fasted. In other words, there is a ceremony that can take place certainly before they go to the church, in which the community recognizes a valid marriage.
That's absolutely true. Thank you for bringing that up. And here's the other piece. Even if they aren't hand-fasted, if they considered themselves betrothed, it was quite common if the families were agreed and everything was being prepared for a wedding, and the couple was in agreement, and the families were in agreement, and the banns were being posted, people started cohabitating before the actual ceremony. Part of this is because wedding ceremonies were the biggest party you would have your whole life, and people want to get married in nice weather. People want to get married by the parson or preacher that they want, who is not always available. So sometimes there's catering to be thought of. Sometimes these things take time to plan. If everybody's happy, why not set up house and we'll get married when we get married. We know from a comparison of baptismal records, so you know when kids are born, and marriage records, that approximately 1/3 of English brides were pregnant on their wedding day. And this was not in any way scandalous. No, there's another scandal here. Yeah.
Also, a proof of fertility on the woman's part was considered a good idea in a time when the Black Death and so forth had depopulated.
There's some, yes, and that actually, this was not something, you know, nobody really sort of articulates that in a clear way, but one of the few grounds for annulling or voiding a marriage in early modern society was proven infertility. There's more cases of this in France than in England that go to court, but yes, marriages were for having children. That was to be expected, and if either party could not have children, that could end your marriage, no matter what you'd been up to. And very often it was the man's fertility. At least in the legal cases from France, it was the man's fertility that was often in question around this. There are fertility trials in France, not in England. No, the weird thing here is that Shakespeare's aged 18 and Anne Hathaway's aged 26. That should be flipped. In a normative 17th century marriage, the man should be aged 26 and the woman aged 18. Why? Yeah.
Because he needs to be old enough to have either, if he's apprenticed, to become a master, or have the property from daddy and be farming. In other words, established in a profession and able to marry.
Yeah,
people married rather late.
That's absolutely right. We tend to think, and Romeo and Juliet does us a lot of wrong here, because there's that phrase in Romeo and Juliet, if you know the play, where someone says, well, isn't Juliet a little young to be married? She's only, whatever it is, she is 15. And someone says, oh, younger than she or happy bridesmaid. Well, maybe in an imagined Italy they were, but in Shakespeare's England, no. Girls did not get married at age 15 or 14, partly because the diet then is not as good, right, as our diet today, which means that puberty comes later, and there is no point to a young girl getting married unless she can have kids right away. So the ages for marriage tend to be based on what marriage is about. For men, you're right, it's about providing for your family, so you probably won't have enough money, property, or skills before you're in your mid-20s to be able to set up a household that would get you a wife, because the marriage is an arrangement between the families as well as a personal arrangement between the couple. And it seems to be about 50-50 on that. Very seldom is it suggested that families should just marry people who don't like each other. That's recognized as a bad, bad thing to do. But given that you could like 3 or 4 people in your town, your family would have a strong say in which of those 3 or 4 you really ought to get married to. And it was very seldom, if things went right, it was very seldom that marriages didn't involve both families making negotiations about what they get and so on. So a man is not going to be in a position to be a good catch until he's in his mid-20s. A young woman, on the other hand, the primary asset she's bringing is childbearing capability. So as soon as she's old enough to be healthy enough to bear children, which is late teens, early 20s, then she can get married. So we don't know why this is flipped. Shakespeare is too young to get married, and Hathaway is very old to get married. Why is this the case? We don't know. We don't. We'd like to, and we don't. There's a lot we don't know, because George Stevens wrote down all that we do know, and this one's not on the list. There's been all sorts of speculation. Yeah.
She could have been a rich widow, a young widow.
She wasn't a widow as far as we know. There's no record of a prior marriage, but she was a good catch in terms of the lands her family had and things like that. So she should have been so and so. The question is, why didn't she get married sooner? And the other question is, why did he get married so young? And we don't know the answer. People who didn't have the kind of background we've just been talking about, who didn't know, just went, oh, he got her pregnant, and then they had to get married, shotgun wedding. Or they flip it and say, she seduced him, this clever, wily 26-year-old who needs to get married now, because the clock is ticking, and she sees this 18-year-old guy, and he's Shakespeare. And so, you know, there's that. What we do know is that Shakespeare's first huge success, which was the most popular thing he wrote in his lifetime, was what? What was the most popular thing Shakespeare wrote in his lifetime? Biggest hit. A narrative poem called Venus and Adonis. It went through 9 printings. It was just, it's not particularly lewd or crude, but it's just sexy enough to be acceptable. And it's sold by the cartload. It was reprinted over and over again. Venus and Adonis is based on a Greek myth about the goddess Venus who seduces a young mortal man named Adonis, and then in the Greek myth, he likes hunting, and he goes off to hunt a wild boar. He's killed, and Venus laments over him. He's turned into a flower. And there were Adonis cults. He was deified, and he was worshipped in what is now Syria. Shakespeare tells the story, but he tells it in a comic vein. And basically, the whole poem is Venus, who is madly in love with Adonis. She has never seen anything that looked this good ever, and she spends the whole poem trying to jump him, while he keeps saying, go away, you're a girl, I want to go hunting, go away, leave me alone, I don't want to do this. And people have wondered, what connection does that have to Shakespeare's family life? This aggressive older woman, this young man who's too dumb to know that she doesn't even realize she's coming on to him for the first half of the poem. And it gets pretty crazy. At one point, his horse, it's a male horse, runs off and starts mating with her horse, who is of course female. And Venus is like, look, see, look. And he's like, what? Look, I want my horse back. I want to go hunting. All I want to do is go hunting. So people have speculated about that. Is there any autobiography there? You will find autobiography everywhere you look for it in Shakespeare, and we never know if there's anything to it, unfortunately. Okay, in any case, in 1585, after 3 years of marriage, they have twins, Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet! Hamnet sounds like what? Hamlet! Wow! Maybe when he wrote Hamlet, he was thinking of Hamnet. His neighbors were named Hamnet and Judith. They were probably the godparents. That's why the twins were called Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet isn't Hamlet, and so there we go. Then there's the mystery. From 1585 to 1592, there is absolutely no record of Shakespeare anywhere doing anything. In 1585, he has a family, wife and 3 kids in Stratford. We don't know what he does for a living. His father was a leather worker. His wife brought some money to the marriage, but he must have been doing something. Stratford is a market town, several days' journey from London. In 1592, Shakespeare shows up in London in the historical records as a popular dramatist and actor. Nobody knows how he got from point A to point B or why. Did he run off to London to seek his fortune? Did he go to London planning to be in the theater? Did he, you know, people have tried to see, were there any traveling groups of theaters who came to Stratford and, you know, he ran off with the circus? I mean, they don't know. We don't know. What we do know is that he spends the rest of the next 20 years or so, from the early 1590s to 1612, in London, writing plays and poems, doing some acting. He makes his money by owning shares in his theatrical company, and he makes a good deal of money. He's quite wealthy, but not because of his acting or his playwriting. Those are things he does for the company as a member of the company, and he doesn't get directly paid for that. But because he's a shareholder in his own company, he makes a lot of money off of the theater business, and he ends up quite wealthy. So what we have in Shakespeare's own family life is someone who has a marriage that is not normative. We don't know why, but would have seemed like a strange marriage to conventional people at the time. 3 children. Hamnet dies young. The 2 daughters survive. Who then, for most of the period of his marriage, lives apart from his family. We don't know if this is by choice, by necessity. Why would he have done that? What are some reasons he might have not brought his family to London?
Was it safe?
Yes, it wasn't safe. London is a breeding house of horrible diseases. And if you want to live a healthy life, staying out of London is a good idea. London also then is an expensive place to live. Shakespeare usually rents little rooms. He cannot afford a nice big house for his family in London that looks like Anne Hathaway's Cottage. Also, his wife obviously is part of the town. She has connections there. Are they happy with this? We don't know. Was this something he was sad about, that he lived apart from his family for his whole life? We don't know. Did he get involved with other people while he was living in London? There are some stories, but we don't know anything in any detail. What did Anne Hathaway do while he was down in London? We don't know that either. What did his daughters think about that? We don't know that either. Was this seen as noble of him to be going off and earning such a good living for them? Or was he seen as someone who ran out? Was he seen as someone who was doing really well for himself in the big city? Or was he seen as someone who had, you know, run off and joined the disreputable profession of the theater? Probably a little of all of it, yeah.
Perhaps they visited each other.
They saw each other. We know that he went home in the summers, or he tended to. That's the speculation anyway, is that he would have gone home in the summers. She may have come with the kids to London. Yeah, it's quite possible. It's not, however, an easy or simple journey. It's 4 or 5 days over rough roads, you know, nothing like a paved road. So traveling is not all that easy. Most people don't do it, but they could have. And it's quite possible that they did. But the one thing that we do know is that he did not live a life as a family man. That life that we saw in the 19th century print is a fantasy in the sense that that was not his normal day. He lived for most of his life apart from his family. After 1612, he returns to Stratford, buys the biggest house in town with the money that he's made in London, and then 4 years later dies at the age of 52, which is not bad for the early modern period. Not great, but not bad. So that's what we know of Shakespeare's own family life. And we can see that it's not, in several ways, it's not normative either for our period or for their period. Most people that get married don't live apart from their families and keep their relationships going nowadays. And in this period, not only did couples not habitually live apart for so many years, but also there's the age discrepancy at the wedding. We don't know what that means, but we know enough to say that his family was not a normative family. Whatever that means. Here's his family tree, and it's too small for you to read it. Here's Shakespeare here. This is kind of interesting. There's a Gilbert Shakespeare, a Joan Shakespeare, an Edmund Shakespeare, and 4 other siblings. So Shakespeare may not have lived with a family as an adult, but he grew up in a fairly large family. How many of those lived to adulthood? Probably the 4 others died, and these 4 lived. So 4 out of 8 lived to adulthood. Richard Hathaway, we don't know who his wife was, but he's Anne Hathaway's father. We do know John Shakespeare and Mary Arden were Shakespeare's parents, and we know some of the grandparents. We know the male grandparents. We don't know who Shakespeare's grandmothers were. Now, if you follow the family tree, Hamnet dies young, born 1585, dies 1596, so he dies aged 11. Judith lives till 1662. She marries a man named Thomas Quiney and has 3 children. Shakespeare Quiney, Richard Quiney, and Thomas Quiney. Susanna marries John Hall. She lives till 1649. She's the older daughter. And they have 3 children. They have 1 children, Elizabeth Barnard, who marries first Thomas Nash, then John Barnard. But then the family tree dies out. There's none of these people have any children, so there are no surviving direct descendants of Shakespeare. Still, that gives us a sense of the sort of larger family picture as far as we can determine it. Okay, let's talk a little bit. We said Shakespeare's not normative. Let's talk a little bit about what we know about what normative was. Yeah?
Oh, I have a question about that last one. Are you saying that it's known that they didn't have any offspring, or?
There's no record of them having any
So it's
offspring. There are no
possible.
baptismal records. I'm not sure what kind of will evidence. Yeah, an illegitimate child that wasn't mentioned in a will is always possible, but as far as we know.
Or the archivists may not have located offspring?
Yeah, or there may not have been, stuff. That's right. I mean, you know, it's hard to prove negatives, but as far as we know, there are no descendants, and there's no record of anyone claiming to be a descendant. By the time that the last people in that family tree pass away, Shakespeare is beginning, 50 years after his death, to be something of a literary celebrity. If there was someone who had a legitimate claim to be his descendant, they would probably be talking about it. So we've already talked about this. The average age of marriage was late teens for women, mid-20s for men. Between 80 and 90% of people got married. Getting married was what you were supposed to do. It was the common thing to do. It was the expected thing to do. Not getting married was thought of as weird for men and women. Marriage was not seriously questioned. Nobody said, shouldn't we be able to live on our own, or shouldn't we be able, very, very few people said, shouldn't we be able to get divorced? John Milton was one of them. Virginity was no longer seen as spiritually superior since the Protestant Reformation. In medieval Catholicism, women and men could choose to remain virginal and not enter into a relationship, a marital relationship, by devoting their lives to the church. Protestant church doesn't do monks and nuns, so celibacy is frowned upon. It's not seen as a superior state. Even though there's a long tradition of that in European Christianity, of seeing virginity and chastity as superior to married life, going all the way back to St. Paul. But in Shakespeare's time in England, no. Divorce is almost impossible. To get divorced, you have to have an act of parliament. So that's not something most people can do. John Milton in the 1640s entered into a horrible first marriage, very poor marriage choice, and immediately, being John Milton, started to write essays and tracts about why sensible people should get divorced if they felt like it. If they were not spiritually compatible, they should just be able to get divorced. For this, he was called a pervert and roundly attacked. And so marriage, not only is it expected of everyone, it's something that once you're in, you don't get out of unless you die. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Most marriages, like Shakespeare's, were between people who had religion, age, and income in common. Most were between neighbors. And this was seen as common sense. You shouldn't marry someone much richer or poorer than yourself. You should marry people you know in your community so that you can pool resources in the town. Maybe your farmland is next to someone else's farmland, and your children could get together, and then they could have a large farm. So those kinds of things. Diversity was not prized in marriage. You were supposed to marry people who were like you, and presumably from your area as well. And this is something that's interesting because there are so many stories in all periods about the beautiful young girl married to the nasty old wealthy man. Hardly ever happened. Very rare for that kind of thing to happen, outside of the very high nobility, where they do anything they can to bring estates into alignment and create political alliances and things like that. But ordinary people, doesn't happen. Courtship tended to be formal. The wishes and needs of families as well as individuals were always taken into account. We talked about that a bit. Because of betrothal practices, many brides were pregnant on the wedding day. Marriages, we talked about this too, marriages were public celebrations. Much more energy and time was put into the wedding feast than the church ceremony. The church ceremony was over in about 10 minutes, and the wedding feast could go on for a week, depending on how much money the families had, how big a show they wanted to be put on. And there are good records of these. We don't have any of Shakespeare's own marriage, but we know that wedding celebrations were the biggest party that the town saw. The Puritan preachers always said this was very bad and very wrong, and everybody just kept partying. Huge public celebrations, eating and drinking all day and all night, and very sort of what we would think of as intrusive and bawdy practices around the wedding night. Usually the couple were put to bed by their friends. They would, hordes of people would storm into the bridal chamber. There would be the woman would take her stockings off. They'd throw them on the bed. They'd roll the lady on the bed. They'd do all these things to sort of celebrate the coming fertility. There would be all sorts of dirty jokes about what was to come in the night ahead. And the next morning they would be woken up by people throwing things at their windows, banging pots and pans, cheering, shouting, and all sorts of things. Which is, what's interesting to me about that is it's so public about something that we think ought to be decently private. And in a society that we think of as very traditional and, religious, this enormous celebration, public celebration of fertility, sexuality, and so on. Now, having said that, marriage was not seen as easy or necessarily happy. All the books about marriage say don't expect this to be easy. Living with someone for the rest of your life, no matter how much you're in love with them, in fact, especially if you're in love with them, that's not going to be easy. You're going to fight, you're going to hate each other, you're going to get on each other's nerves, there's going to be conflict. It's not happily ever after. It's the beginning of a long, difficult process where you are going to have to be reminded over and over again that you promised God you would stay together and that the two of you have to stick with each other to help each other through the inevitable hard times. And all the sort of advice literature, and there was a lot of it around marriage, assumes that marriage will have its pleasures, but that it will also be a challenge. It will be the hardest relationship you ever have. And that it's going to involve a certain amount of friction, and that there are ways that one deals with that. Wives were legally subordinate to their husbands. This was just the way that things were structured. Wives could not own property separately from their husbands. They were commanded to obey their husbands as part of the traditional marriage ceremony. Husbands were legally allowed to beat their wives, though most people said this was wrong. It was morally wrong, but you had a legal right to do it. So that's something that we need to remember when we're talking about traditional marriage of the period. 6 or 7 pregnancies were the norm across the span of a marriage. This was about what you could expect. The purpose of marriage was to have a family, and so multiple pregnancies were common. Till death to us part usually meant about 20 years of marriage. People would marry in their early 20s, and life expectancy meant that in many or most cases one spouse would have died by the mid-40s. This gets us back to all those broken families in Shakespeare's play. It's normative to lose one parent by the time you're a young adult.
Was it more typically the wife that died because of childbirth?
That's a good question, and I've been looking into this actually. 1% of pregnancies ended in the death of the mother, which is not that bad. However, of course, you're looking at 6 or 7 pregnancies, so now you've gone up to your risk of dying in childbirth just went up to about 7% more if you had more children. I don't think so. I don't think it was more women or more men that died young. The women would die in childbirth, but the men would die in accidents or in fights or in the various ways that men die. Falling down the stairs drunk, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Are they absolutely sure about that? Because maybe some of that wasn't reported back then.
Well, these,
I would think that would be higher.
this, I thought it was too. My source on that is Lawrence Stone's Family, Sex and Marriage in Early Modern England. I think it's based on surviving burial records. So, and everybody belongs to a church. Some of the churches burn down, but they do have pretty good records on how many people get born and how many people die because it's sanctified in the church. The babies are baptized and the deaths are always recorded in the church register. So for a particular community, if the church records have survived, you can tell pretty close what happened. And of course, if there's a birth a day before the mother dies, you can tell that that was probably a result of childbirth. Many children died before age 5. That was the most common thing. If you lived past age 5, your chances of living into your 40s, 50s, 60s, or even later were not too bad. But getting to age 5 was a real challenge. And this is something else to remember about family life. Because of apprenticeships, children often left home in their early teens, as early as 12. So one of the big differences between families in that period and families now is that the families didn't last very long. You know, the time between a child being born and a child turning 12, that's not very long. And then if one of the spouses dies a couple years after that, it's not this sort of, we often think of family relationships in terms of 30 years, 40 years with kids still going home and seeing their parents and the grandparents being involved and so on. But because of the patterns of the way people live and also because of mortality rates, the amount of time people live together as a family is much shorter for them than it was for us. So here's a normal 17th century family, if there's any such thing as a normal family. A young man or a woman would have 4 to 6 siblings. So very few only children, lots of medium-sized families. 2 or 3 of those siblings, however, would have died as children, which means that by the time you're 7 or 8, you've seen your brothers and sisters die, because everybody dies at home. Men marry in their 20s, women in their late teens, we've looked at that. The couple that gets married like that would have 4 to 6 children. 2 to 3 would die as children, which means that burying your children is a common occurrence too. Surviving children often left home as early as 12. Half of the marriages would end with the death of the spouse in the first 17 years. Remarriage was common for the surviving spouse. So there are lots of second marriages and third marriages, not because people are getting divorced, but because people are dying. And if you look at this, you can see that there are all sorts of differences in experience and structure and so on from the way that we live our lives now. I'm going to end by talking a little bit about some of the ideas around relationships between parents and children. One of the things that I've been working on recently is the idea of the relationship between possession or ownership and affection, and what it means. How did early modern people think of their children? What was their idea of that relationship that they had with their children? And one of the most interesting places I found for this is it's from the story of Lucretia, who's a figure of Roman legend, and she was a heroine of Shakespeare's narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece. This was his follow-up to the sexy Venus and Adonis one. This one is it's a lot darker, and it wasn't nearly as popular. And after that, he stopped writing narrative poems and went back to writing plays. But the story of Lucretia, basically, she's a Roman. It's the early days of the Roman nation. They're ruled by kings. Lucretia is the wife of a Roman general. The Roman general is out with his buddies talking about their wives while they're on campaign. He says he's got the most wonderful wife in the world. They start to argue about what their wives do when they're out of town, and they decide, we're close to Rome, we're not a long way away on campaign, let's go back and check what our wives are doing. They go back. Lucretia is the only one who's doing what wives are supposed to do. She's sitting there spinning with her housemaids. All the other wives are partying and drinking and carrying on. So that looks good. Lucretia's doing very well, and everyone's really proud of Lucretia, but one of the men that her husband has been, bragging about her with is a member of the royal family, and he develops this passionate lust for Lucretia, and he goes back later when her husband's not there, and he says, your husband said I could stay with you, and she says, okay, be a guest in our house, and he comes in, and then that night he rapes her. And she is outraged by this and feels, you know, sort of horribly violated and shocked, and in response she kills herself. And this is by Raphael, the Italian painter. This is a picture of Lucretia about to stab herself. And so what happens is all her relatives are so shocked at her death and so angry at her rape that they kicked the kings out of Rome and found the Roman Republic. So it's a foundational myth for the Roman state, right? And there's all sorts of interesting things we could say about that. But in Shakespeare's poem, what's interesting is not so much what all the relatives say, it's what her father says. And her father is not normally a major figure in this story. But here's what the father says after she's dead. "Daughter, dear daughter," old Lucretius cries, "that life was mine which thou hast here deprived. If in the child the father's image lies, where shall I live now Lucrece is unlived?" In other words, how could you kill yourself? You are mine. I gave you life. You weren't allowed to take it away. You've taken something away from me. You've taken my life away from me by killing yourself. That's an interesting model of parent-child relations. Now he goes on in this vein. Here's what he says next. "Poor broken glass," and by glass he means mirror, "I often did behold in thy sweet semblance my old age newborn. But now that fair fresh mirror, dim and old, shows me a bare-boned death by time outworn. Oh, from thy cheeks my image thou hast torn, and shivered all the beauty of my glass, that I no more can see what once I was." In other words, you, my child, you're a mirror of me. And now that you've killed yourself, all I see in the mirror is death. By killing yourself, you've killed me. Notice the stress on me here. It's very much, I mean, this is a phenomenal, and this is one of the things that I'm sort of thinking my way through. It's a phenomenally possessive way to understand your children. That their life is your life, and that if they kill themselves, they're taking something away from you. And one of the things that I'm really interested in around this is very often in Shakespeare we see combined in the same character what we would think of as horrible parental possessiveness and what clearly is meant to be signs that this is a doting, loving parent. There's no suggestion in this passage in The Rape of Lucrece that he doesn't love her, but it's a very odd way, from my understanding of it, to express that. Here is a more standard version of this.
It's also interesting that there isn't a suggestion that in his mind this is a reasonable response or it restores the honor of her family.
No. I mean, that's part of the reason that I went into all that backstory about Lucretia. Is this is the time to make a big political statement about the death of my daughter will lead us to rise up and destroy the tyranny. No. He's like, you broke my mirror. It's a very odd moment because what you would expect is this huge outpouring of sort of justified civic rage, and what you get is a father saying, "You're mine, how dare you destroy yourself, you belong to me. You've harmed me by killing you." This is the more common version of the loving father in Shakespeare. This is Juliet's father in Romeo and Juliet, who is a doting father, who takes all these precautions for Juliet's wedding, and when she thinks that Juliet is dead, he just falls apart. But when she says she's not going to marry the person that he's chosen for her, he says, "And you be mine, I'll give you to my friend, and you be not, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets." Okay. Dad. And this kind of, again, the sense, you're mine, so I'll give you to my friend. And, you know, that very, very strong sort of sense of possessiveness there. Again, echoing the kind of, it's a different register, but the same kind of thing that we see in that Lucrece quote, yeah.
Do you think that was more common with the girls then?
Well, here's one of the interesting things. It is in some ways more common with the girls, and I think the gendering of this is really interesting, and that's something I'm also thinking through. Shakespeare doesn't, I mean, after Hamlet dies, Shakespeare is the father of daughters. And we haven't talked about his will. People who have tried to sort of psychoanalyze his marriage have often looked at his will. And what his will says, and we have his entire 3-page long, single-spaced will. His will says that all the good stuff he has go to his beloved daughters, and his wife gets his second best bed. And so basically, the wife gets left out of the will, and the daughters get everything, which suggests that he was very fond of his daughters or felt close to his daughters, or suggests that he didn't much care for his wife. And people have done all sorts of exegesis on this. Maybe the second best bed was the bed they always slept in. Maybe it's the cozy bed. Maybe the best bed is the one with the plastic over it in the front hall. It's the second best bed, you know. But the one thing you clearly see there is that the daughters get lots of stuff, that he was a father that doted on. And a lot of his plays turn around fathers and daughters. King Lear, for example. The Tempest, for example, where this is the central relationship in the play, is father and daughter. Winter's Tale, too. A lot of the later plays. But you know, this kind of attitude is interesting in that in other parts of Romeo and Juliet, it's clear that Capulet adores Juliet, and yet it survives along with this kind of an attitude. And I'm going to end with one more example, which is my favorite example of this, and this is from Kenneth Branagh's film of Much Ado About Nothing, which was done about 20 years ago now. It's well worth watching. And one of the things that happens in that play is that a young woman on her wedding day is slandered. Some people who don't like her and don't like her husband, her to-be, create this totally fabricated, crazy, false, impossible story that she's been sleeping around. The husband-to-be believes it instantly, as does her father. He's convinced, on absolutely no evidence, that she has betrayed the family honor, that she's acted horribly, that she's been promiscuous, that she's ruined the wedding, and that she's to be cast out. And this is the daughter here, and this is the father here, and the whole community is sort of having to keep them apart. And here is what Leonato says, and it brings up these things again, and I've highlighted the key term here. Why had I not with charitable hand took up a beggar's issue at my gates, who smirched thus and mired with infamy, I might have said, no part it is of mine. This shame derives itself from unknown loins. But mine, and mine I loved, and mine I praised, and mine that I was proud on, mine so much that I to myself was to myself not mine valuing of her. Oh, why, she has fallen in a bit of ink. There you go. Mine, myself, mine. This is clearly an attitude that Shakespeare is quite familiar with, whether it's from his own experience or his own feelings or examples of people that he's known. And notice what he's saying here. He's saying, now that you've acted like this, I wish you were adopted. Because if you were adopted, I could say you weren't part of me. And that's interesting too, because it suggests that there's a connection there, and this is something that I've written about in other contexts, that there's that sort of material connection, parent to child, flesh of flesh, and so on, is much stronger in some sense in these kind of possessive structures than just, oh, this is a member of my family, or this is part of my... There's that sense that this actually is part of me, therefore I own it, therefore it is mine, therefore it should do what I tell it to. And a lot of Shakespeare's plays show how dreadfully wrong this can go as the kids are growing up, and King Lear is the classic, but yeah.
Isn't that normal? I mean, you get reflected from what people you love, what people who are part of your family do. And if they're shamed, you're shamed.
That's definitely true for the period. I think what's interesting to me here is not Leonato's grief, which actually I find in some ways moving, though in other ways it's monstrous. What is interesting to me is Leonato doesn't for a second believe his daughter. She's going, I never did it, I never did it. And there's no evidence, and we know it's not true. But he, the minute it's brought up, he's like, I knew it! And it's that's the relationship there that's interesting. So that's pretty much all that I have to say about this topic. There's lots of other stuff we could talk about, but we're running short on time. Yeah.
Well, I want to, this of course is in a cultural context.
Oh yeah.
This was at a time when you had legal doctrines, for instance, of corruption by blood.
Oh yeah.
There was this kind of connectivity. There was sanctifying and recognized in law and socially and by the church and otherwise.
No, I think that's absolutely true, and it's one of the things that I think is great about Shakespeare is that you can see how that kind of legal structure and the kind of thing that, you know, you read about, oh, there was this and there was that, but in Shakespeare you see how it works emotionally. That, you know, this becomes this kind of moment of rage and despair and so on. That, yeah, it is in a cultural context, and it's not necessarily our cultural context, though our cultural context goes back to that and is connected to it in all sorts of ways that we still find, I think, compelling. So, are we done?
We are done. I think Shakespeare looks like Ian.